best laid plans, they generally go wrong. I had included the videos in the slideshows, which would work beautifully if I was in class. However, my recording software appears to hang once the video plays for a while. So what you need to do is go onto Blackboard and you need to look at the videos. You can either, it's on Blackboard, topic 1, the video is called Economic Systems, or you can go onto YouTube. Here's the URL for the video. Well, alternatively, you can just search for topic 1.3 Economic Systems and you should find the video quite easily on Blackboard. Okay, so once you have watched the videos, guys, the key things that come out of the video, or the video in this instance, is that what is an economic system about? It's essentially a socio-political system. In other words, sorry, I'm also recording notes at the same time. It's essentially a socio-political system, guys, where the political party in power decides on the allocation of resources. In other words, they decide what should be produced in a particular economy, how it should be produced, and for whom it should be reproduced in a particular country. And this is a reflection of the social values and goals of that society, i.e. we vote for the political party that reflects our social values and goals in order to install the political system which we want in the country. So just to go back on it, I'm covering what was covered in the video, but in the first place, a market economy is one in which free market forces operate or dominate. So there's pretty much freedom, guys. So supply and demand determine what products are supplied to whom, i.e. businesses supply products according to what people are prepared to or able to buy within a particular society. So within a free market society, if you look at the slide, guys, you are free to choose who you work for, what work to do. You can be an investor, entrepreneur, you can do whatever you like in terms of business. Obviously, there are some limitations, but you're pretty much free to start whatever business that is legal, as long as you can compete with other businesses or existing businesses. You're free to buy, own, use, and sell private property. In fact, private property is a key pillar of a free market economy because the ownership of private property is guaranteed within a free market economy. You're also free to set prices, which can be good, but they also pointed out in the video it allows for exploitation, and this is often obvious when it comes to companies like drug companies who can charge exorbitant prices for medicines that we all need because they control or own the patents to those medicines, and there's nothing that you can do about it. The worst case example is in America, where people actually die because they cannot afford basic medicines, such as the case of diabetics who cannot afford insulin, and then basically they die younger than they should, etc., because they don't have the money to pay for their medicine because it is so expensive in that society. Okay, so what is the role of government within a free market economy? Government is essentially there to create an enabling environment. So government creates an environment in which competition can take place. So one of the problems that you have in free market economies is sometimes you have producers colluding, fixing prices. An example is in South Africa, where the bread producers fixed prices between them, so they set a minimum price for bread. So you weren't paying prices based on competition between the bread producers. You were paying a price that ensured that they made profits at the end of the day. And this often happens between companies as they behave unethically. So government therefore enforces antitrust or competition laws to ensure that the forces of a free market society act freely and properly within the economy. The second key role of government is preserving property rights. So government has to ensure that private property, when you buy something, it remains in your name, that there are mechanisms in place to register property rights, etc., but also then to create a stable fiscal and monetary environment. It's difficult to operate a business where your currency fluctuates in value the whole time, where there is political instability and people are rioting, or the government's changing the whole time, etc. So the government, essentially a free market economy, is there to create as stable an economy as possible. Key aspect, as we've already said, is economic freedom, guys. That defines a free market economy. You can buy, sell, do whatever you like, obviously within certain limitations. And there's something called the Index of Economic Freedom. Okay. The bottom line is, guys, that countries, if you look at this table over here, per capita GDP, I'll talk about gross domestic product now, but it's basically the amount of activity in the economy for each citizen. So right at the top there is Luxembourg, which on average is about $90,000 per citizen, and right at the bottom is our friend Zimbabwe and Angola, which have on average, Zimbabwe's very low GDP per citizen. The economy has essentially collapsed. Angola, which is a growing economy, Venezuela, $10,000, etc. As economic freedom increases, generally your average GDP, in other words, the average amount of economic activity in a economy per citizen increases. So the countries with the greatest amount of economic freedom also tend to be the greatest or have the highest GDPs. Economic freedom does not necessarily equate to political freedom. So some of these countries may have very oppressive political systems. China, which is its citizens, their GDP is growing, the people are getting richer in China, has got quite an oppressive political system, but also countries like Kuwait and UAE and some of the countries up top there that are politically quite restrictive have fairly free market economy. So you can basically do any business that you like within these countries, but they are often one-party states, etc. So they're ruled by single parties and they don't have democratic elections at the end of the day. Okay, so my index of economic freedom, So my index of economic freedom indicates some of the richest and or the countries rather. Let me reverse quickly. Indicates countries that have the greatest level of freedom and also tend to be quite wealthy. If you look up there, Hong Kong, which interesting enough is ruled by the Chinese, which is politically one of the most restrictive societies on the globe, but they were previously ruled by the British. Singapore, also fairly politically not the most free society out there, but New Zealand, for example, Switzerland, Austria, which are really strong examples of democracies. But the point is, these countries have the highest economic freedom, i.e. they are the easiest to do business within these countries. The countries on the other side, which also tend to be some of our poorer countries, People's Republic of Korea, North Korea is one of your most restrictive countries in terms of economic freedom and political freedom. Basically, the people are dirt poor, if you want to put it in practical terms or basic terms. But Venezuela, Cuba, Congo, Eritrea, etc., Zimbabwe, these are countries that restrict the political freedoms. In other words, they make it more difficult to do business within these countries, and they also tend to be poor at the end of the day. So it's an index measured out of 100, and the most free country on this one is Hong Kong, and the lowest one is the People's Republic of Korea, which is also known as North Korea. So, pardon. So, where does South Africa fall on this? Currently, South Africa, 58.8. So we fall somewhere in the middle. We've got a fair amount of economic freedom, but the government also meddles to some degree. And if we look at our gross domestic product, it is not as we're not one of the richest countries in the world. So that gives us an indication that perhaps the government needs to free up our economy, etc. But the other side of the equation is that the freer your economy is, often the less rights your workers have at the end of the day. So it is not as straightforward as simply giving business all rights, etc. It can have very negative implications for the people in a country. America, which has high levels of economic freedom, also has unemployment and poverty. They're the richest country, highest gross domestic product on earth. They're the richest country on earth, or one of the richest countries on earth, but they have about 10% of their population that lives in utter poverty, which must say there's something wrong with our free market or capitalist system at the end of the day. The second type of economy that they spoke about is communism or command economy. Centrally controlled, single-party state. We have very few command economies today. Cuba is probably the only example of a pure command economy, and North Korea, although North Korea is a complete dictatorship, it probably goes beyond what was envisaged by the command economy. But the government owns everything. Or the government, as in the people, they own the factories, the productive facilities, all economic resources. Everything belongs to the state. Okay, as you will have seen in the video, as you will have seen in the video, the government decides what to produce, how it should be produced, and for whom it would be produced. So if you live in a communist state, everyone has bread, everyone has milk, everyone has a fridge, everyone has somewhere to live, everyone drives a car, hypothetically. Okay, but, and that's a big but, everyone has white or brown sandwich loaf. There's no ciabatta or French loaf or raisin loaf or any exotic bread, or for that matter, any exotic products at the end of the day. So the government provides for everyone, but it tends to be at the lower end of the scale. But if you also look at communist economies, if you read the book by George Orwell, Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. In theory, it's a great idea, but when it comes to practical implementation, it often does not or has not worked in the past. So why hasn't it worked? What are the key reasons for failure? They don't create economic value. There's no incentive. Why should I work harder? Everyone is basically a public servant, so everyone gets paid the same. Whether I'm a street sweeper or a heart surgeon, theoretically I get paid the amounts of money. So why? There's no incentive for me to study to become a heart surgeon other than it's for the good of the people. But there's no incentive for people to be creative and to create business and to create new products and services, because there is no profit within a command or communist economy at the end of the day. All the profit is in the hands of government. So there's no drive to create profit. Okay. No communist economy has measured up to the achievements of market economies. They generally don't satisfy consumer needs and improve the quality of life, and essentially leads to poor economic performance, poor populations, and economic and general disillusionment. But by the same token, we can note countries like Cuba that have fairly well-performing educational systems and hospital, medical care systems, etc., that actually perform quite well, while the general population is also fairly poor. So it is not all good or all bad, because, as you already said, that in free market economies, the poor get left behind. If you are poor, if you are sick, if you are unable to provide for yourself, the economy does not care about you. They do not provide any resources for you. It is basically on the principle of the fittest survive, and if you're not one of the fittest, too bad, too sad, go die in the gutter. Unfortunately, the free market economy can be quite heartless at the end of the day. Okay. In the video, I mentioned a third type of economy, the mixed economy. Okay. So government realizes that not all services can be provided by the private sector. It's not viable to provide all services by the private sector. They mention, for example, education, hospital care, police, etc. Okay. These can be provided by the private sector, but it's not normally economically viable to do so. In other words, it makes more sense for the government to provide these things for the population. South Africa is a mixed economy. What does that mean, guys? You can basically open any business you like in South Africa. However, it comes down to that certain businesses such as rail transport, electricity, certain aspects of medical delivery, the police, the army, etc., are provided by government. So government controls certain key sectors which are meant to deliver key services to the population. So South Africa, the UK that I haven't got on the list is a key example of a mixed economy. Germany, Brazil, Indonesia, different countries, it's not unique. So here, the state does not plan anything or everything. It rather influences certain sectors within the economy as opposed to allowing the pure operation of market forces at the end of the day. Sorry, just let me pause here for a second. Okay. So, guys, a key aspect within economic development that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture is, or within the key aspects of the economic environment, is economic development. Okay, so guys, bottom line is, how can we measure whether one country is better off economically than another country? So here, we need to look at something that's known as, or we need to look at different measures of economic activity, but also something that is known as purchasing power parity. Okay. My first measure of economic development is gross domestic product, GDP, and gross national product, GNP, which indicates the general economic activity within a country, i.e., it indicates the value of all transactions carried out in the country, and then it is divided by the number of citizens within that country to get an average. So my definition of gross domestic product per capita is a measure of the country's economic output that occurs for its number of people. It divides the country's gross domestic product by its total GDP, the measure of a country's economic output that accounts for its number of people. It divides the country's gross domestic product by its total population. That makes it best measurements of a country's standard of living. It tells you how prosperous a country feels to each of its citizens. Okay, if you look at the formula, guys. So it says, number one, if you look at it, the formula is C plus I plus G plus X equals GDP, which is gross domestic product. C is personal consumption expenditure. So that is the amount on average that is spent by each person buying goods and services, i.e., it keeps a record of all the transactions that are conducted within the economy. Okay. Then the second one is I, that's non-residential and residential investment. So the total of all the money that is invested, so in other words, not used to buy goods and services, but goes towards investments that are meant to grow over time, etc., both by residents and non-residents. The only distinction between GDP and GNP is that GNP excludes the non-residents investments in a country. The next letter in the equation is the G, government expenditure. So the government spends money on building roads, hospitals, police stations, providing health care, you name it. Whatever the government spends money on. The government normally does not for example, build its own roads. It puts out tenders, which means that companies tender or put in tenders. The road is then built, and those companies employ people. They buy goods and services to build the road with. They hire machinery or buy machinery. They use electricity, water. So they contribute to the economy. And then, guys, the last one is X, which represents the net exports. Okay, so it's exports minus imports. What does that mean, guys? A country imports goods that it requires, and it exports goods that it produces. So, in the case of South Africa, we have something that is known as a export deficit. It means that we import more than we export, because our main import into South Africa is oil that we use to produce petrol with, that the economy runs on. We do not have our own sources of oil, or we have very limited sources that cannot provide for the economy. So we import a great deal of oil, and we don't export as much stuff as we import at the end of the day, which is not good for our GDP, because we have to pay for those imports in dollars, and we are paying for or buying more dollars than we gain through our imports. So it implies that, or it weakens our GDP at the end of the day. Okay. Now, if we have to compare countries' GDPs, if we look at the poorest countries in the world, guys, this is, it's not the most recent one, I meant to replace it, but anyhow, it's not that important. Okay, so if you look at the richest country in the world, Luxembourg, United States is right up there, South Korea is doing pretty well, India, Liberia, China, down the other end of the equation. Okay, but again, this is 2007, so it's a little bit out of date. But the problem here, guys, is that it is not equally comparable. So on average, let's say if you live in Mexico, there's on average $12,000 of economic activity per citizen. While if you live in the United States, there is $45,000 on average economic activity per citizen. Does it mean that you're better off in the United States? Yes, likely, but it does not reflect the dispersion or how economic activity is spread across people in a society. For example, Liberia has some very rich people because they have oil, etc. But if the oil resources are controlled by a very small number of people who are very rich, and the majority of the population lives in absolute poverty. On the other side of the scale, I already mentioned the US, where generally the level of lifestyle level is pretty good. People earn good incomes, etc. However, you have to take into consideration the cost of living. For example, if you live in San Francisco at the moment, you need about $100,000, which in today's exchange rate is about 1.8 million rand, although that was 1.2 million rand at the beginning of the year, in order just to live a middle class lifestyle, i.e. rents, costs of property, everything is extremely expensive there. So GDP does not necessarily take into account differences in costs of living. In fact, it does not take into account costs of living. So it gives a fairly static picture, but it is still an indication of the general wealth of a country. So America is a large country, large population, and it's basically the richest country on earth. Even though Luxembourg has got a higher GDP, it's a very small country with a small number of people living in it. And there's a saying that if America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, and that is very much the case at the moment. America is essentially going into a depression, which means they are buying less goods and services because of COVID-19, and this has the implication that the rest of the world is also going to go into a depression because we cannot export goods and services, or they won't buy the goods and services that they used to buy from us, which by implication means fewer people will be employed, earn less money, etc. So it is not a